Okay, this video is just a summary of how relative prices can be used to help Australia to answer the three economic questions, and then a bit of a lead-in as to how relative prices can impact living standards. So the first question is how relative prices impact what to produce, and essentially relying on the market mechanism or relying on demand and supply will mean that resources will be allocated based on to the goods that are in high demand, so that's consumer sovereignty. So when the relative price of a product increases, we will shift more resources to that product. And you need to articulate really clearly in any market mechanism question. So the demand sends a clear price signal to economic agents to shift more resources to that area. They're the key buzzwords you want to use. Consumers are the main driver of resource allocation. So if there's falling prices, that will signal there's been overproduction and lower profits and incomes. So I've been teaching you to talk about higher prices. If you feel that you need more time sort of flushing out your answer to these questions, make that link the other way as well, that if the relative price of something goes down, that will signal overproduction and resources will flow out of that industry. Profits and incomes will be maximised if resources are reallocated to other uses if there's less demand. In terms of, so one particular question might be why reliance on the price mechanism often results in an unequal distribution of the products, not a distribution of income, but an uneven distribution of the amount of products that are made. So some things will have a lot of demand, some things will have less demand, and therefore there'll be more products made than other things. So again, define what the price mechanism is. So changes in demand and supply will influence relative prices and determine where our scarce resources are allocated. So the key to this question is clearly articulating that producers are self-interested and are only going to produce products that they can generate a profit. So for example, if there's more demand for alcohol rather than Vegemite chocolate, then we're not going to have the equal amount of alcohol in Vegemite chocolate. Self-interested producers will shift resources into alcohol and away from Vegemite chocolate because there's only profit opportunities available in that industry. So that question's about defining the price mechanism, articulating that producers are profit motivated, then making that link that with an example as to why they'll produce more goods, some goods than other goods. Relative prices and how to produce, we talked about this in class, but relative prices and how to produce is determining whether producers are labour intensive or capital intensive. So if it's more cost efficient and the relative price of capital is cheaper, they'll decide to be more capital intensive and vice versa. So it's about the relative price of capital versus labour. If whatever is the cheapest and most cost efficient is what they're going to use. And then provide an example. So e.g., because it's cheaper to use self-service checkouts, the relative price is lower. If we raise the minimum wage, we'll be more capital intensive, etc., etc. In factor markets, so how does the price mechanism affect factor markets? Well, the relative price is all determined by the demand and supply of labour. So resources will shift to where the higher relative price is, so that will send a signal to owners to where to shift their resources. So if there's a shortage of engineers, for example, that's going to lead to a higher wage, and that will send a clear signal to people to start working in that industry. So in the labour market, the price mechanism sends signals as well, and what that really means is that the higher wage is reflective of a shortage and more demand, and their resources will shift into that industry. And more people might decide to study engineering and become engineering because of the higher wages. For whom to produce is unlikely to come up, but it's basically a country will produce based on consumers' willingness and ability to pay. So resources are going to be allocated to those areas that are in demand, and that will be determined by who's willing and able to pay for that produce. So who is willing? Well, in Australia, that is generally those that own land or they have access to higher quality capital or labour resources. So most of the products that are produced will go towards those that are willing and able to pay, because that's how you're going to generate an income. So the question of for whom to produce is based on people's relative wages, and that determines who gets access to resources within a country. So relative prices, relative wages determine who gets access to goods and services. Those with higher relative wages get paid more and get more access to goods and services. Unfortunately, if the market was perfectly free, there would be a highly unequal distribution of income, so the government steps in and reallocates resources when equity is not achieved. It's unlikely you'll get a question on for whom to produce, but it's really about producing for those who are willing and able to pay, and their wages are determined by the demand and supply of their labour. Relative prices and the impact on living standards is the last part of this chapter. So when we're looking at living standards, it's important you've got a really strong definition there. It incorporates both material living standards, which is about the ability of households to access goods and services, and that's generally measured by GDP per capita or income per person. So when we're measuring material living standards, we're trying to get an idea of the purchasing power of the average citizen. It doesn't take into account other quality of life factors. Non-material living standards are all the other factors that contribute to an individual's quality of life. So that can be the quality of human relationships, crime rates, access to welfare, public health, etc., etc. And the quality of the environment also comes into non-material living standards. What you need to argue, and we'll do this more in Chapter 3, is does the market mechanism allocate resources efficiently and to try and maximise our living standards? So there's both positives and negatives here. Using demand and supply is considered the most effective way to maximise a country's living standards. It's generally efficient because self-interested producers will allocate their resources to what society wants because that will maximise their profits. So it helps to maximise society's wants and needs because they'll produce what's in the best interest of consumers. They respond to consumers' needs and therefore resources are allocated to maximise material living standards. So a couple of things about them. In a competitive market, relative prices act as a signal to producers and consumers to produce more of that good or services, and suppliers will be constantly monitoring prices to make sure that they're producing the goods and services that are going to maximise society's best interests. If there's a change in relative prices, that provides the incentive to produce more of that good and helps to maximise more of society's wants and needs. So when you're talking about in relation to living standards, talk about the responsiveness of markets, that they are highly responsive to consumers' demands and that therefore they're very good at producing what society wants. So for an example, a good example of how the market helps to achieve allocative efficiency, if there's an increase in demand for chocolate, that's signalling that people want chocolate. Their living standards are going to be higher if they get chocolate. This will shift the demand curve to the right and lead to an increase in the price. This provides the incentive for current suppliers to shift resources into that industry and also to other potential suppliers that it's a lucrative market and they could benefit from entering the market. Remembering that in a competitive market there are low barriers to entry, so it's really easy for competitors to join and enter that market. In this way, the change in price has resulted in a reallocation of resources into the types of goods and services that consumers want, and therefore it's more allocatively efficient. If this was a socialist country, that shortage might persist, and therefore it's not as good for our living standards. So you're really talking about the responsiveness of markets here to meet consumers' wants and needs. Other reasons the market mechanism promotes living standards, if producers don't respond to consumers' needs, they go out of business. There's this high incentive, so when we're looking at technical efficiency, there's this high incentive to continue to develop and come up with new ways to produce to try and remain technically efficient. Otherwise, you're going to be undercut by your competitors. So businesses are always striving to make better products, to be innovative, to be adaptive, to keep prices low in order to attract customers. So we get what we want in a competitive market generally, which is allocatively efficient. Producers are productive because they're always looking at better ways to do things because of the high level of competition. And that high level of productivity leads to lower prices, which allows us to buy more goods and services and improves our material living standards. This promoting of technical efficiency helps to boost our material living standards. Lower prices, more output, we get produced what we want because the businesses are responsive to the price signals. And there's always innovation as well. And that's just a bit of a summary. High levels of competition makes sure they implement the least cost methods. They need to be technically efficient. Because there's low barriers to entry and therefore to maximise their profits they've got to keep prices down. Increased productivity leads to more choice as well as lower prices and therefore helps to boost our material living standards. So linking it really closely to allocative efficiency through that signalling function and technical efficiency through that ability to keep prices down. Weaknesses, you also need to be aware of some weaknesses related to living standards, and it's mainly both non-material. So market economies, relative prices are determined by the quality of people's labour, so there's generally high levels of inequality when we rely on relative prices. This could potentially lead to higher levels of crime and social unrest because of the big discrepancy in incomes, anxiety amongst low-income earners, mental health problems, all potentially reducing our non-material living standards. So relying on price signals, paying people on price signals can lead to inequality, which then leads to more problems for our non-material living standards. The pressure to respond to price signals to remain competitive could also make owners of factors of production more stressed about losing their market share, and there's also a lot of pressure to boost productivity, which can cause stress for workers as well. Market economies may not provide a range of services that could boost our material and non-material living standards and can actually produce things that detract from our living standards. So there's a high level of inequality. There can be stress to keep your prices down, stress to keep up with what's going on in the market, and it can also lead to overproduction of things like alcohol and cigarettes and things that are bad for us, which also hurts our non-material living standards as well. Inequality, potential stress, anxiety and social problems, and overproduction of harmful products. So here's just a quick example to finish. Explain why a competitive market is likely to promote both allocative and technical efficiency. Define what's meant by a competitive market. Explain what's meant by technical efficiency, and talk about the high level of competition forcing producers to keep prices down and maximize productivity. If they don't do this, they will be undercut by other businesses. They're always looking for better ways to produce and invest in new technology. In terms of allocative efficiency, when demand for products increases, there's likely to be more supply because they respond to price signals. There's no restrictions preventing supply, so people get access to what they want. Why might it hurt non-material living standards? Well, it results in shifting resources to where there's high demand and greatest profit, which can lead to more pollution. It can also lead to longer working hours for producers as they incentive to maximize their profits. For example, the shifting resources to minerals cause more pollution and environmental depletion. It can also lead to higher inequality because of the high discrepancies in incomes, as well as crime rates and social status anxiety from the high level of inequality between workers, as well as increased stress. Thank you.